Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adi, and today we have our first Series 1 team report from Scarlet and Violet. I'm really excited, and I'm joined by a player who got top 8 at the first Limitless tournament. Up-and-coming star, we have Giovanni, or Polar Bear. How you doing?
Hi, my name is Giovanni Siski. I'm 19 years old. I'm local to Dallas, Texas. I started watching the game during 2014 U.S. Nationals, and I didn't actually figure out how to entirely get into competing until 2018. 2018 Dallas was my first regional, first event. I competed in seniors back then. Um, I did not complete the game in time because I got the game for Christmas. So I did not have the Mega Ring because I didn't complete the game. So I was playing with no Mega. And I had Zimu Volcarona, and those who have played in seniors in a format where Scarf Landers is a staple know that it is running rampant in seniors every single time it's used. So I was stuck with a Form 1 team of Rotom Wash, Togekiss, Porygon 2, and Scrafty for my entire run, and I somehow managed to still go 3-2 and end up 12th, not netting me any CP, of course, and one of the major reasons why I didn't end up qualifying for Worlds under the 250 CP bar for seniors in that year, but I just continued to stay with the game and progressively play each year. Things I'm most known for, I guess, would be my 2020 LAC Challenge champion win in the Ultra Series format post Worlds in 2019. I had rank 1, 2, and 3 simultaneously on the BDSP ladder with all unique teams, 3 different accounts there. I got carried to an MPA 11 championship this year with the puppies. I
Let's
didn't,
go,
uh,
puppies.
I didn't, I didn't do much in terms of my actual results when I was fielded, but it was nice to hear all of the top players internationally discuss what they thought was strong and how they prepared going into each week and how they prepared even for events. Since we got a season back this year, finally, and then for 2022, I hit over 2,000 on Showdown, playing Lunadon in between with Wolf's team that he used at Secaucus. Pretty much the exact same thing as that, in between that and Milwaukee, even though I ended up sticking with Banfox's of Eldon for the rest of the year. And that got me top 32 at Milwaukee and then 38th at NAIC. I ended up starting second one and then losing my last 2 rounds. My final round actually against Gilgamesh, which Banfox ended up telling him the exact way to guaranteed win against the Veldon with that, where you just lead Mimikyu Amoonguss and you win. Because I was testing with Banfox the night before his top 16 set, and I was like, "Hey, can I test this lead real quick?" And I was like, "Sure." And you just can't break Mimikyu Amoonguss. You get Hexed, you get Spored, you get Will-O-Wisped. Cali Ice gets in, Policy activates, and everything just drops to Glacial Lance. There's just nothing to be done there. So I just helplessly kind of sat there for 20 minutes, losing to Gilgamesh and having a very disappointing end to the season there.
But definitely, I mean, something to build on. Getting, again, top 32 at a regional, top 64 internet, some really solid results on top of that NPA championship. I know, of course, we were both in the same team, so I got to see you, practice really hard, develop, and then your results both online and in person really showcase, again, just your consistency and talent. And now to get this really, really big result at the start of VGC 2023, and what was it, like a 550 player tournament, something incredible like that. You got all the way to top 8 with this team. So, talk me through. The game's been out for about 2 weeks now. Talk me through what these last 2 weeks have been like for you in terms of VGC.
Okay, so when the games had initially released, my goal was to just beat the game, the story mode, as fast as possible. I know a lot of people wanted to take their time and enjoy it, but well, as I've stated already, I had multiple instances where I got the game later than everybody else, and that I didn't actually have adequate tools to compete in events. at the level that I wanted to. So I figured it was mandatory for me once I got the game, because I knew there were going to be big tournaments like this, even though it wasn't announced yet. There just always are. It's the hype around a new game that's out. There's going to be a new format announced around the time of late November, early December. That was the expectation. And we were just playing an unofficial format at the time, where a lot of people were experimenting with everything new. And I was just playing in room tournaments like everybody else on Showdown, and playing the unofficial like Battle Stadium doubles ladder, just throwing things at the wall and seeing what stuck, and trying to figure out just how everything functioned in the new game for the most part. Going into when Series 1 was actually announced, I figured that a lot of people were going to have less practice than I was, just because this format is fairly comparable to 2014, which is when I started watching. So I think I had a decent amount of ideas and how I could play around them going into Series 1. And I felt like I had a better understanding of how a lot of these Pokemon functioned in comparison to most other people, just because they're very similar, and a lot of the same Pokemon are similar, and even a lot of the same cores translate, such as Hydreigon Goldango, which is very similar to that of the classic Hydreigon Aegislash back in the day. Uh, just looks a little different, but it feels even stronger than ever, right? So I expected that to be very big. I expected Dondozo Tatsugiri to be very big, as that was like used since day one, since everything was uploaded to Showdown. Everyone was testing with that, and it seemed to be very dominant until people started realizing that everything is just stat boosts, and you can nullify those um, in a plethora of ways, where a lot of people have used Murkrow with Haze as well to deal with it. And that if you find out a very consistent way to deal with Dondozo and Tatsugiri with your entire team, like, you're not going to beat it with one Pokemon. You have to come up with a coherent strategy to beat it. That's just how it is. And I figured that I could approach it in a more unique way than a lot of other people were doing it. Thanks to this Gastrodon, mainly. But I'll touch on that later as I go into like each of the individual Pokemon roles. And then lastly, I expected Armarouge and Didi to be fairly common going into this tournament, and that was another reason why I was very much adamant on using Tyranitar going into this event. I thought that Tyranitar was a good call for a lot of the Armarouge that were going to show up. And I was fairly happy with at least that metagame prediction, as all of those teams ended up being towards the top in the usage stats after the tournament was over. Those all ended up being within the top 10 or top 15, all of those Pokemon. So I'm very happy that I settled on this in the end.
Yeah, it definitely, like you said, you have both silver bullets and into a lot of those matchups that we expect to be really good at the start of the format. And on top of that, your silver bullets are just all around good Pokemon, which is something that I have really been looking for in the early format. Like you said, you can kind of find individual Pokemon that beat stuff like Nindozo Tatsugiri. You don't want those Pokemon to be unbringable into other matchups. And same with NGD Armor, same with all sorts of other stuff. So really looks like a very solid, well-rounded team. Notably, does not have any new Pokemon on it. Um, was that something that was a conscious decision, or that just happened to end up that way? You mentioned you took a lot of inspiration from like 2014.
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily intentional, but I also figured over time, as I started to play more of the newer Pokemon, that if I was going to play a lot of newer Pokemon, that people who have just built better fundamental ideas around the newer Pokemon were going to be more successful than me. And as I started to come up with this build, I didn't really feel the need for any of the newer Pokemon. They didn't really mesh well, uh, even though I didn't do a lot of testing. I just kind of put uh, three in my team builder, then added a fourth because it made sense, and then added a fifth because it made sense, and then finally added a sixth because it rounded out the team. Like that's just how it ended up being. Uh, and then once I tested that, I just made only a few slight tweaks, such as Garchomp originally had Clear Amulet with Earthquake Rock Slide and Swords Dance, and I tested that for a bit because I thought that it was very synergistic with the two ground immunities with Rotom-Heat and Corviknight. I thought that Swords Dance Earthquake could be very strong, um, but it just felt a bit weak in a variety of matchups where two reasons that Swords Dance wasn't as useful was because one, it takes more than 2 turns for Swords Dance to be more effective. You're just stronger. You do 2.6 times damage with 2 Life Orb hits when you're only doing 2 times damage after a turn of setup and then actually attacking. So Life Orb is just more effective there. Two, this team has a very strong defensive core, and Garchomp is expected to switch a lot more. And if I can bring it in later, it's much better as just a late game sweeper, and I'm not forced to set up as much. And running Life Orb allows me to run both stabs and rock slide as coverage, and that's very strong. I get the damage that I need. I have a much more potent offensive combination with Life Orb Earthquake and Choice Specs Discharge. Like those two together, I ended up winning a set in my tournament in maybe 10-15 minutes just by spamming those two moves because my opponent just didn't have a matchup for it. Um, and the damage output is very strong between those two, and I'm certainly very happy that I switched from Clarinet to Life Orb because I saw the drastic decline in Intimidate usage,
Mhm.
and even in situations where I was getting burned by Will-O-Wisp, it wasn't hard to play through at all because I just have other ways of dealing damage. I have a lot of damage on this team, especially if you give it enough turns. I'm going to very quickly start out damaging my opponent, or at least putting myself in a very favorable position to start dealing out damage. And that was kind of the approach with the Garchomp, was that I didn't need Lumberry, I didn't need Clear Amulet. I was just very happy with standard Life Orb, but I wanted to try out Clear Amulet just because it was a newer item, and I wanted to see if it could potentially have some success there. I was actually just as interested in preventing speed drops from Icy Wind because I thought that was going to be a little bit more popular than it ended up being. I thought that was just as beneficial as preventing Intimidate, but Intimidate still ended up being a little bit more common than those other stat decreasing moves. So
Mhm.
I'm fairly happy with the call to settle on Life Orb instead of Clear Amulet.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic. Just not even just right now, but just for the rest of the format. Is Clear Amulet is only really good. Well, it's not only really good. It obviously blocks Parting Shot. It blocks Icy Wind, like you mentioned, Snarl. But it is especially good when Intimidate users are all over the place. And as Clear Amulet increases in popularity, Pokemon like Arcanine might decrease in popularity. And there's going to be a real balancing act when it might be the meta call. Intimidate users might be the meta call 1 week, and then Clear Amulet the next week. It's going to be really hard to figure out. But I think what you mentioned about how Life Orb is just doing more damage no matter what the situation, without any setup, without anything, like you have to have an Intimidate user on the field for it to gain value, is really cool and a good reason to run Life Orb Garchomp. And yeah, on that note, did you want to talk me through the individual Pokemon on your team? You already mentioned Garchomp a little bit, and why you trained them the way that you did.
Garchomp was just relatively standard Life Orb, nothing too crazy there. As I already mentioned, the reasons why I wanted to stick on Life Orb after a lot of testing with Clear Amulet. I actually, to make the final decision, because it was at the time Friday evening, and I had not started to even worry about getting any of these Pokemon in on my Switch. Um, that endeavor was very fun. Took about 3.5 to 4 hours to EV train this all together, hatching eggs and whatnot, and catching them, getting the Terra types functional so that this could be used. Garchomp was just made to be uh, complementary to the Rotom and Corviknight that I ended up putting on the team. Very synergistic there, and allows you to have very solid matchups into a lot of the opposing dragons, especially considering the support that this team has for the Garchomp. You're able to not only be able to pick up one of KOs, but you're able to force Terra types and forcing your opponent's hand in this format. Uh, from my experience, can lead to very advantageous positions and very commanding wins. And Garchomp was like added as I think the third or fourth Pokemon. I believe the fourth Pokemon to this team, and I definitely needed something more proactive because this team was just a lot slower and more bulky, and I needed something that allowed me to actually attack first under some circumstances without needing a turn to actually generate some offense. And Garchomp certainly filled that role as well. And lastly, I'll touch on Sandvale since I'm sure some people have already noticed. Um, Throughout the tournament, I actually didn't avoid that many moves with Sandvale, um, but it was still nice to have. And the few moves I did avoid, even though they weren't necessarily crucial in giving me wins, uh, it was certainly better than Ruskin could have ever been. You're just not getting as much value out of Ruskin. When you decrease someone's chances down to 80% on any 100% accurate move, you're already taking a fair amount of control out of your opponent's hands in the game. And if you can make the game less consistent for your opponent, they are going to have a lot harder of a time trying to find consistent ways to win against you. Um, with some RNG here or there, of course, um, games can like matchups can just be unwinnable if you avoid one or two moves with Sandvale. And Ruskin doing 1/8 damage is a little negligible considering I can get that sort of chip damage off of one other attack, which this team
Mm-hmm.
is very easily able to uh, get off with the amount of bulk it has.
Right. And the benefit of like breaking focus sashes, for example, you already have a Tyranitar that helps do that. You have a bunch of spread moves that might
Right.
not hit super effectively, but do that. And I think just in general, people talk about getting unlucky a lot, but I think that your team choice can often dictate how lucky or unlucky you get. And on this team, you have the ability to dodge attacks with Sandville. You have the ability to rock slide flinch. You have the ability to discharge, paralyze, stuff like that. You don't always get those things. You don't play necessarily with those things in mind, but the opportunity to have those will inevitably happen a few times over the course of a tournament, and it will inevitably win you games. And so, one thing I like about the team is that you don't have a ton of moves that can miss, and you have a ton of moves that can work in your favor in terms of getting a little lucky okay, over the course of a tournament.
Right. It's very consistent, and I found that while these secondary effects are very strong, like you almost never need them, but when you do get them, it will either make a game that is a toss up a complete landslide now, like it will just be game deciding, um, and it'll certainly make unwinnable matchups winnable, even though I haven't encountered any matchup that is unwinnable with this team yet. I feel like this team does actually have a pretty solid matchup spread thus far. I'm sure we'll see some team come up in the next few weeks that will be very crushing into this, but I don't blame any of the losses in the tournament on my team. I think that the losses I had were just because of errors, however big or small they were, that I made, and that was on me. But yeah, the team is very consistent, and especially when you're talking about a tournament that has 9 rounds, you're going to get some of that RNG eventually in your favor. Um, no matter how small it is, like crazy stuff happens all the time in this game. Especially if you play a lot, you know what I'm talking about. You've been on both sides of it, right?
Hmm.
We all have.
Yep.
Um, and just having a lot of the those chances to um, influence games entirely out of what your opponent can dictate is very strong.
Yeah. And so I guess on that note, do you want to talk to me about the other Pokemon that uh, maybe has the potential to get the luckiest in Rotom with Discharge? A really powerful move. You have two ground types on the team that can soak those up, but also not only powerful, also has that really strong paralysis chance. Why did you put the Rotom on the team, and why did you train it the way you did?
Yeah, so originally I had started this team with Tyranitar, Corviknight, Gastrodon, and Rotom is just the natural fourth there. I felt like it complemented the type chart very well, and if you go look at all this team's weaknesses and resistances, the most glaring weakness is Ice, at only 2 weaknesses with Garchomp and Amoonguss, both of which have Terra types that can at least somewhat alleviate those weaknesses. Um, I, in fact, had a set where I had to terrestrialize my Garchomp both in game one and game two to take an Ice Beam from a Gastrodon. Um, that's, I guess, an example of what I'm talking about there. Um, so this team is very hard to break, and if your opponent's going to make a read, they really have to commit, um, because your team has just great resistances all around, and that's kind of ironic considering that there's a Tyranitar on this team. It's not something that you would think would happen with a team that has Tyranitar, but uh, team's very strong defensively. I can't stress that enough. And Rotom was able to pair really well with the Gastrodon and provide really good coverage need for the team. I didn't have a more aggressive way of hitting, bulky waters and steel types. Like only having Gastron for steel types isn't exactly preferable. So it paired very well there, and it was just an overall solid, really solid Pokemon. I thought that Specs was like if I was going to use Rotom-Heat, I was going to use Choice Specs. If I'm going to use a bulky Rotom-Heat, I'd probably just go with Wash and then fill the team around Rotom Wash. I feel like Rotom Wash is stronger um, with a more bulky set. And I really didn't like the idea of relying on Will-O-Wisp. That was just not very appealing to me. And even with Rotom losing Ally Switch going into Generation 9, um, there were less things going for the supportive set in my mind. Even though I do think, at least on Rotom Heat, it was less viable in my opinion. And I thought that Specs was just overall stronger. And I already had Corviknight and Gastrodon, two bulky Pokemon that had recovery moves and focused more around their longevity, like to stay in the game and to control the game with Tailwind and Icy Wind. So I just needed more damage out of Rotom, and Choice Specs was able to provide that.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. On to Corviknight. Um, I felt very inclined to use this Pokemon for a few reasons. One was that I used Corviknight Tyranitar Gastrodon at 2020 Dallas. Um, I got about 30 minutes of sleep the night before, showed up, started out 4-0, then went to 4-4, and then finished 6-4. Got CP, ended up showing up the next day because it's within driving distance for me, so I didn't have to spend the night there at the hotel. I came back and I ran it back with the same team I used and got to the finals of the MSS. Um, had 183 players. I think it's still the biggest MSS to ever happen, if I'm not mistaken. I ended up losing to James Beck in the finals, and I was just very impressed with Corviknight and Gastrodon as a pairing. And I thought that Mirror Armor was one of, if not probably like the most overlooked slash underrated abilities in recent memory of VGC. I thought that Mirror Armor was like underappreciated, and I didn't think that people really brought out its full potential when it saw good placements. I still felt like it was capable of doing more because its ability is so unique, and it's actually like a lot stronger than people give it credit for. Um, you're able to make really really cool plays. Just besides leading it into intimidate, you can put a snarl and switch it in to lower special attack on an opposing Pokemon, uh, and you can do that with Icy Wind as well. Other stat dropping moves that you can reflect back to the opponent and really mess up positioning, and then you can set up Tailwind and then go from there. That was really, really key to this team's success. Oftentimes in matchups that involved Dondozo, Tailwind was actually still very valuable because you could have a lead of Rotom Gastrodon or Rotom Amoonguss or like any combination of not the sand mode most times. I actually did end up bringing the sand mode probably just as often into Dondozo teams as I did the Amoonguss, but that was because I played a few Terra Steel safety goggles Dondozos that end up just hard walling Amoonguss. So because it's open team sheet, I just can't bring Amoonguss. And fortunately, it's open team sheet, so I know not to bring it. Um, and I guess while I'm touching on Dondozo real quick, I do. Well, I guess I'll leave that for the matchups, but at the very end. But Corviknight was just very strong, able to control a lot of the matchups in the metagame with Tailwind, and oftentimes served as a nice win condition in end games where you're facing against opposing Garchomp or fairy types, um, Pokemon that just don't deal a lot of damage to it because it has very solid typing. Anyone who's played 2017, 2018, or I guess even 2019 knows that Celesteela can just win games on its own, and Corviknight with the same typing, albeit not having Leech Seed and not having as insane of stats, still has a good ability and still has the utility to support the team while being its own win condition, which is very strong. And Terra Flying is also very good to remove your Steel type weakness, uh, or your Fire weakness with your Steel type, which actually came into play multiple times. And when you are Terra Flying and you Roost, you have no weaknesses
Mm-hmm.
because you lose your flying typing for the turn, and
Yeah.
that's a pretty cool aspect to it as well.
Um, so I also brought Corviknight to this tournament. Did not do nearly as well as you did, but I had Taunt over Bulk Up on a very similar set. And I'm curious how Bulk Up performed for you.
Yeah, I noticed that a few days before when I was looking more into this team, like this core that I had started, Kiwamu Endo Alcana, who got ninth place at 2018 Worlds, actually used like a Rocky Helmet Corviknight with taunt that did very well on ladder the first day that it opened up, and I considered it a little bit, but also I didn't have enough room for taunt. I felt, and this may be just because I have a more Western view of team building, and I am not as creative as some of the best players in the world, but I thought that bulk up was very solid because it allowed you to 1v1 Garganical and Tyranitar even, which is just absurd to think about. Um, and it was just very solid with Roost and leftovers. Leftovers could have been replaced, but I found that the recovery over time was very useful, and there were a minute number of instances where Lumberry would have been more effective. And I don't know what other item would have been better. Certainly no Resist Berry or any 33% Berry would have been better. I think Leftovers was very correct because there are some times where you just need to go for damage or go for setup or set up a Tailwind. And in the times where you would rather just not be using Roost, like every 3 turns or 4 turns, you're getting half of that Roost HP back with 4 turns of being on the field, and Corviknight is very easily able to achieve that as well. And so just it synergizes very well with Corviknight's longevity, and actually synergizes very well with Roost, which is weird to say, but you can make a lot of you can scoop a lot of calcs into Corviknight with Leftovers recovery, with just how long it's on the field and how often you can just switch it out if you're not able to get setup going. Bulk Up was almost never used, but in the times that it was used, it was very good. You also have the nice perk of walling Dondozo if it's not unaware. I don't know why people wouldn't run unaware, but I've seen it a few times. I didn't see it in this tournament, but it's still useful in that matchup. Just because you can get speed control to your partners and match the Dondozo +2 on speed, and just with their other Pokemon allow them to still attack first if they want to. And that was very, very good on Corviknight.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So talk me through the rest of your team.
Tyranitar was just meta call for this tournament. I figured Indeedee Armarouge was going to be relatively popular, and I knew that Hydreigon Goldingo was going to be pretty popular, and I felt that Tyranitar covered both of those options pretty well. I have been playing Tyranitar even when I'm not supposed to. I used Tyranitar to top 32 the Victory Road Galar Farewell tournament with Ho Dialga. That was an interesting team. And Tyranitar is one of those Pokemon that it was one of the most dominant Pokemon early on in VGC. I believe it made every World Finals between 2011 and 2014, if I'm not mistaken.
I
It made
believe it.
all 4 of those. I think so. I wouldn't doubt it if I'm not exactly sure on that, but I believe that's the case. It's just a very versatile Pokemon, has good stats all around, and even though its typing is not great defensively, it becomes actually very beneficial because you have weakness policy, and there aren't many attacks that can 1 KO Tyranitar in this meta. So you're just able to get a weakness policy boost if opponents aren't careful enough, and I thought that it was even more threatening in open team sheet, because it means that if you're going to attack the Tyranitar with a super effective attack, it needs the KO, or it needs to be doing a lot of damage to assist its partner knocking it out. And that allowed for free turns of Rock Slide, Crunch, Dragon Dance. A lot of times it would be enough of a threat to where I could just protect. And I find that Protect is a very, very strong move, especially strong just because of how threatening a Pokemon can be. And that's why I think Amoonguss' best move is Protect, actually, instead of all of its other insane support moves. It's just such a strong move, and if you can catch a double up into a Protect on any given Pokemon, you're getting a lot of value out of that turn, and Tyranitar certainly being very threatening, and being able to just perfectly counteract the Hydreigon, the Armarouge, the Indeedee that I expected to see was very useful.
Yeah, it definitely, you hit it on the head that Tyranitar has a lot of weaknesses, but doesn't go down to 1 hit. And because of the weakness policy, they have to put 2 hits into it. And it's very easy to figure out when your opponent is in a position where they feel like they can hit the Tyranitar. Because a lot of times they just can't. They aren't allowed to in fear of weakness policy. And so having Protect is really important. Having things like Amoonguss to redirect those attacks is really important. And then you have a ton of good defense switch-ins to almost every type. You don't have any good fighting switch-ins, funnily enough, but pretty much everything else you can switch into pretty comfortably with at least one Pokemon.
Yeah, that ended up being a problem of mine in round six where I played Gahaku. He was using Hamster Mania's team, the one with the Gallade,
Mhm.
and that was very strong because it's able to hit the vast majority of my team for very, very hard hitting damage with sharpness. Um, but I didn't consider it to be too much of an issue, considering I figured that Hariyama was going to be like one of the most popular fighting types, and even that's slower, and I can do a ton of damage to that with Dragon Claw, Thunderbolt, Volt Switch, Brave Bird. I can Rage Powder away close combats. Um, Hariyama is not very effective in any board position where Amoonguss is there, able to redirect. Even if it's Flame Orb and you can't even Spore it, just having the redirection there is very nice because at best they're hitting with non-stab knockoff, and that's not going to get rid of Amoonguss for another 5 turns, 4 or 5 turns after you lose your items. So
It does get Headlong Rush now, which is a base 120 ground close combat. So it does have a little harder ways to hit Amoonguss,
yes,
but still,
yes,
I think maybe only three-shotting with that.
yeah, it has limited options for sure. Um, and even then, I would hope that I'm playing well enough to at least threaten the Hariyama at that point or remove it entirely. Or at least I shouldn't be allowing a Hariyama to headlong rush my moves 3 times. But yeah, that is
Mhm.
interesting to note that these Pokemon having new moves can certainly change up this. And I think it makes AV Hariyama a little bit more viable, especially because it has, I believe it has elemental punches as well.
Mhm.
It's just hard to justify giving up Fake Out and Wide Guard. Like having to give up one of those just doesn't seem um,
Right.
like a
And
very good candid choice because spread moves are always going to be in the metagame. It feels like they're just so strong, so powerful, and if you can synergize them with the rest of your team, you can get a lot of wins just by off the sheer power of them.
yeah, I mean, another fighting type. You mentioned Gallade is basically a new fighting type because it has a new ability that completely changes the way that it's played. Palmot is another fighting type where we didn't get to really play with it on Pokemon Showdown as much. So we didn't get to test with it because of Revival Blessing being bugged. It is now more or less fixed, and a really interesting option that also looks really threatening for the team potentially. But yeah, fighting types kind of few and far between. So not having a ton of resistances and then having Pokemon like Corviknight, as well as just strong neutral moves that hit it, is often enough just to deal with it, especially since they all have secondary typings, except for Hariyama.
Yeah, yeah. I guess this is a perfect time to talk about Gastrodon next, since I haven't really touched on it too much. Um, I went with Earth Power, Ice Wind, Clear Smog, Recover. I didn't feel the need for Protect. I never, well, not that I never really miss Protect in testing, because whenever a Pokemon doesn't have Protect, there will be situations that come up where you do need Protect. Like that's just going to happen. It's just the nature of the game. But in the vast majority of situations, Protect wasn't like very necessary. A lot of times, you just want your Gastrodon to actually be doing something helpful to make progress. And Icy Wind and Clear Smog were used almost infinitely more than Earth Power was. I feel like Earth Power was actually the least used move throughout my entire tournament run, which is kind of hard to believe. But you get so much control over the game with Icy Wind, and considering that there were a lot of stat boosts in the metagame with just a variety of moves like Dragon Dance and whatnot, and Dondozo Tatsugiri as well. I felt like Clear Smog was a very solid option, especially because Gastrodon was primarily uh, used to be a check to the likes of Dondozo, Tatsugiri, Rotom Wash, etc. Um, and that's also why its stereotype is Fairy, because you can completely wall the sets that have Order Up Wave Crash or Order Up Liquidation. Um, Fairy is also a great defensive type overall. Its only two weaknesses, you actually resist both of them with Gastrodon, with its water ground typing. So if your opponent ever is going to trying to hit Gastrodon expecting it to be Terra Fairy, they have to make the hard read because otherwise you're going to take that attack very well. Um, And the Terra Fairy idea actually originated when we were playing the unofficial format. It was like the first or second day, and it was myself, Jamie Keane, and Brady, Norwegian player, and we were just all playing in room tours and spectating games and just trying to find out what's good and what's strong and understand how these Pokemon work. And we were all like, how do we break down Dondozo as a team archetype? Because half of the teams that people were playing had Dondozo and Tatsugiri, right? That's just how the early metas go. Like when there's an intriguing Pokemon, a lot of people latch onto it and start playing it, and it spreads like wildfire.
Mm-hmm.
And it started with Terra Fairy Storm Drain Tatsugiri from Jamie. He said that, and he was sold on it, and he ended up making it work once, and it was very funny. I'll admit it. But then Brady was like, "Gastrodon's just better for that role in every way, isn't it?" And of course, the Gastrodon haters don't agree with that one, but of course, I kept that in my mind as I went to go with Gastrodon, and I felt like that was just the most logical choice. And it helps you just take a lot of neutral hits as well, um, which is very useful. Um, it's just an overall solid Terra type. It can force Pokemon that have Dragon Stab to use other coverage moves to Gastrodon as well. And Icy Winds hit the likes of Garchomp, Dragonites, and just lower speed overall is very useful. And especially with Scald being gone, I mean, you're not going to use Chilling Water. It's just too weak of an attack. And I never really saw too much of a reason to deviate from this set. I thought it was very strong. And Citrus Berry was just there for its longevity. I didn't feel like leftovers would have been as useful, considering Gastrodon only has one weakness to grass, and in the off turns where you do want to recover, um, you really need it in the times that you actually need to use it, and you're going to be going for that every time that you need to anyway. And Citrus Berry can make a lot of 2-hit KOs, 3-hit KOs, and with how bulky Gastrodon is, I actually found it not being 2-hit KO'd at all throughout the entire tournament, besides maybe Terra Ground Earthquake from Garchomp. But if it doesn't have a life orb, I don't believe it will even do enough to 2-hit KO thanks to the Citrus Berry. If it's life orb, I believe it has a chance, or it does. But I mean, that just goes to show like Gastron was, I think, a very good check to Garchomp, as it was the most common Pokemon in the tournament. And I was able to cover switch-ins from Garchomp very easily with Icy Wind, and if not, then I was still getting a speed drop, which helped my positioning for following turns.
Mm-hmm.
And Gastrodon, I think, was overall just very good Pokemon. One of my most used Pokemon, I believe, as well. Came to a lot of matchups. Another really good Goldengo check as well. Your Earth Power is doing, I believe, 80 to 85% usually to Goldengo, and that's a lot considering that Gastrodon's not the strongest Pokemon.
Yeah.
And when you have two other Pokemon that resist Make It Rain, and one of those being a 4 times resistance, you can, and the Pokemon that do have Protect are the ones that would not appreciate being hit by it as much. So you can just protect the Pokemon that are weaker to the Make It Rain or not resisting it, and just allow your Pokemon with the resist to take the hit and force the Goldengo to -1,
Mm-hmm.
and just play from there. And that can oftentimes um, like lead to very favorable positions, if not just win games entirely off of
Yeah.
that interaction.
Yeah. Absolutely. Guldengo is maybe the public enemy number 2 after Dondozo, or number 3 after Dondozo and Amoonguss right now. So having that, I mean, you have so many Pokemon that do well into it, and then on top of that, having, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you have Protect on the ones that don't, because it will lose that special attack boost, or have it take a special attack drop rather, uh, by attacking it to protect at a Pokemon that eats the Make It Rain for breakfast. That is a really cool interaction that I hadn't really considered. But yeah, and then last but not least, we have Amoonguss, which I think is the best Pokemon in the format right now. Uh, Tell me about Amoonguss.
I definitely think it's in contention for one of the best. I think that Hydreigon will continue to soar in usage. I think it's a very oppressive Pokemon when it finds the positions that it's useful in, and especially if it's complemented by a partner that can cover its weaknesses or just use terrestrialization to cover its weaknesses. It's for itself. It can deal out a lot of damage, and it can actually be very good as a supportive set as well. I think I played 3 Assault Vest Hydreigon in day 2 as well, which is a weird stat, but that set seemed to be relatively popular. So I guess watch out for that. That seems to be a meta trend now that's picking up. Um, but anyway, on to Amoonguss. So Amoonguss, I felt like since this format was comparable to 2014 in some senses, and by that sense, it's somewhat similar to 2018. Not in terms of all the Pokemon that are being used are the same, but the power level somewhat feels the same as 2018. Um, because I feel like Terra types can somewhat match Z moves, especially if you're able to attack for multiple turns. I felt like Clear Smog, just based on the amount of stat increasing moves and abilities and whatnot were in the metagame. I felt like that was just fine as it was. Rage Powder and Spore, just obvious moves on Amoonguss. It's why you use Amoonguss. Um, I feel like if you didn't have both of those moves on Amoonguss, then I would find it very questionable. Like, you just have to have them.
Yep.
And I saw a lot of Amoonguss that just didn't have Protect, actually. I didn't get to play against many of them. I think I played against 1 or 2 that didn't have Protect, out of like the maybe 3 or 4 I played. But I think Protect is its best move, as I said. I think that because you are so threatening with just your kit is like just with Spore and Rage Powder to be very disruptive. Sleep turns are a whole other thing past that, past just the threat of it existing. That you can force double ups, force just attacks to be wasted into Protect, and now that you can Terra type and remove some of your weaknesses, it becomes even more threatening, just as a passive supporter. And ironically makes it one of the best matchups into Torkoal, just with Terra Water. It's a Torkoal matchup in itself. And Mental Herb was mainly used because Murkrow has Taunt, and you can bring it into Murkrow if need be, and just invalidate its existence. I saw other Pokemon, I think Mousehold. I think I played a Mousehold on ladder when I was testing that had Taunt on higher ladder. That was interesting, and I was just able to Spore away and control the game from there, and it was just over off of turn 1, just because Spore can provide so much value, especially when with one turn you can be very defensive, and then on the next turn you can be dealing out a lot of damage with the rest of the team. So I felt that I didn't feel the need for any resist berry. I thought that Amoonguss was super bulky already, and I felt like Citrus Berry belonged better on Gastrodon. I do think that Citrus Berry is a strong move item item on Amoonguss, but that's as far as I would go in terms of berries. I don't think any of the 33% berries are going to be as useful, just because you're asking to be at 33% HP instead of 50% HP for 8 more percentage of health, which is a very risky trade-off. And I would only see it being used on more complex spreads that would only come up later in the format as it develops. I don't think that's. I think it's just relatively inconsistent earlier on in the format, right? Because you just don't know what attacks you're going to be taking for the most part, and just having that consistency is good.
Yeah, I feel like the only time that you can really reliably get it off is on a Pokemon, maybe like Corviknight, where it has recoil moves like Brave Bird, and so you can kind of get yourself in that range if you need to. But other Pokemon, it's going to be so hard to consistently do it, and sometimes you can use it as your second Citrus Berry, but it's just clearly not as good as Citrus Berry because of the like marginal difference in healing that you're actually getting.
Yeah, that's fair. And I also considered that, yeah, Mental Orb was very strong, and I also felt like Regenerator itself was just a berry in itself a lot of times because of how much switching this team is able to do. This team has a lot of safe switch-ins for almost the entire metagame, so you're able to heal yourself up like multiple times in a single game, and that's just often better to have. And having the utility of the mental herb to get
Mhm.
past taunt is incredibly useful and forces opponents to actually knock it out instead of just taunt it and ignore it, which makes it an even bigger threat
Yep.
and forces like opponents can't just invalidate it. Is the point? It's still going to be a support Pokemon, and once I tried Mental Orb, I was sold on it. I didn't feel like I needed any other item just because um, it's already so bulky, and you don't need anything else to increase its longevity when its ability already does that on its own, and you can Terra type to increase its bulk as well. So I felt like Mental Herb was just the obvious choice all around.
Yeah, I mean it's so good into the Murkrow teams that were everywhere in this tournament. Um, But yeah, on that note, do you want to tell me about your tournament run? You got all the way to top 8 out of 500 and odd players, but 455 players, it says on your very nicely put together document. So talk me through how your tournament run went.
Okay, so all right, I ended up waking up like maybe 30 minutes left for check-in, and I was not like really feeling like playing, but I just figured like, oh well, I'm already up at this point. Let's go for it. Um, Round one, I ended up getting Mr. Penguin, who's a pretty established player from Ecuador, one of the strongest players in Ecuador. Um, I believe he has multiple Worlds invitations. I believe. Uh, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And I don't think I need to like really reinstate how strong of a player is by the fact that he got to 18th place. He made day two after losing round one. Like that's pretty mental. Like really impressive run back.
Mhm.
Um, the majority of this matchup revolved around my Gastrodon, my Rotom, Corviknight, and Garchomp for all three games. And I ended up losing game one just because the Garchomp got a Swords Dance up and ran away with the game. And game two and three, I think I did a much better job of preventing that. And the Gengar was trying to keep my Corviknight in control with taunt for games one and two, where game one he got me with the taunts, and then game two I predicted it and Brave Birded on the taunts, and then game three I predicted the Shadow Ball, and I Tailwinded, predicting him to not taunt since it was already so obvious at that point. Um, and like I was already showing that I was willing to just attack through it, and I would say that this was a good matchup for me overall. In game three, I was able to force an early Terra Fire on the Scizor, which opened up a lot of opportunities. And even though it set up a Swords Dance on turn one, um, I had brought Gastrodon, Rotom, and Corviknight, which all can very, very easily take Bullet Punch at +2. So it's just forced to use Pounce the entire time, which is not the strongest move. And even then, I resisted with both Rotom and Corviknight at that point. And I'm just going to sit there and start using Bulk Up if you don't
Mhm.
switch out. Um, so Scizor, I could just ignore it. And plus, I was also threatening it with Earth Power at the time with my Gastrodon. So it was more or less forced to switch to Rotom. And after I got the Tailwind read correct in game three, I just ended up winning the set from there. Like that was just something like it was just over at that point. My Garchomp and Corviknight were able to just Earthquake and Brave Bird and Dragon Claw everything, um, and I was just able to win it from there.
Yeah. Uh, Seems like a real wake up call at the very least. Definitely, when you have run one, you play such an established player. It's always a real confidence booster for the rest of the tournament, knowing that you beat them, especially watching them do well for the rest of the day.
Yeah, I was actually like I couldn't believe it for a second that I saw his name like at 7-2. I was like, wow, he actually made that run back, which is very impressive. I think that anyone who has done it or anyone who has known anyone who has done it understands like how impressive that is because you have to go 7-1 in your next eight, uh, which is basically saying that you start out and win the winner in before it's absolutely mandatory. Like it's just an insane run back from him. And I think he played really well on our side. It was just I think the matchup was more in my favor. The Gastrodon was able to control a lot of the matchup, and he only had Rotom for Corviknight, really for
Mhm.
consistent damage. So and he couldn't really bring in DD or Armarouge because the threat of Garchomp and possibly me bringing Tyranitar. He doesn't know if I'm ever going to bring Tyranitar. I can more or less invalidate that, and I believe that this one was not Terragrass. I can pull up the team sheet right now, but yeah, this one was Terradark, right? This one was Terradark with goggles,
Mhm.
Heatwave Dark Pulse. So it wasn't very useful in the matchup, and yeah, I mean, I don't think he could have done much better given the tools he had to work with. But yeah, I think that he certainly played well, and he certainly played well enough to me where I believe that he could definitely um, do well in the tournament still, and he did very well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess the another notable player that you played is Kyle as Animus in round four, and that looks like the first Indozo team that you played, a team that we've talked so much about, although albeit a very unorthodox build of the team. So tell me about that matchup.
Yeah. So fun fact: this was a pretty poorly played set by me, and I think he played pretty well. Game one, I ended up leading Garchomp Amoonguss into Needy Armarouge, and I didn't bring Tyranitar. So as you can imagine, Expanding Force is very threatening. So both turn one and turn two, I end up Rock Slide flinching the Armarouge, and that's just the game. Just forfeits after turn two. There's nothing really to be done there. Like that's just the game. Like it just happens. It was my one out and I got it. Like there's not really much more to say on that.
Mhm.
Game two, he ended up leading Lycanroc Armarouge, and I ended up going with Garchomp Tyranitar, and I got Rock Slide flinched through Sandvale on turn one as he ended up going for Energy Ball, I believe, into my Garchomp as well, putting it pretty low. And then a few turns later, after I Dragon Clawed the Lycanroc on turn two, I missed Icy Wind as I went for Terra Fairy to not get knocked out by the Energy Ball. I just missed Icy Wind on the Lycanroc, and that pretty much just sealed the game. And even though like that RNG is like much more split up by the turns than mine was in game one, I was actually like 6 times more likely to get my RNG than he did his. So I guess I can't feel too bad about how the game one went, even though I still do feel guilty. Um, yeah,
That's
it was
Pokemon.
a 7.7% chance for two Rock Slide flinches while hitting them both, and it was a 1.2% chance to flinch through Sandvale and then dodge Icy Wind. So I mean that's just how it is. That and I mean I found it amusing during the game too. I couldn't be mad, especially with how the
Mhm.
game one went. Like I can't be upset about that at all. It certainly happens, and I just had to be ready for game three, where I went with Garchomp Corviknight, I believe, into Lycanroc Armarouge again, and I went for Dragon Claw into the Armarouge slot that switched into Indeedee, predicting Endeavor into my Garchomp, which I got correct. He was trying to catch Earthquake on turn one, and from there I just got a pretty good advantage, and then it liquidated down to a 3v2 where Armorage Tyranitar was in Trick Room, and I had all 4 of my Pokemon. At the time, I had a low HP Garchomp and a Rotom-Heat on the field with a full Corviknight and I think a 60% HP Gastrodon or something like that, with Citrus Berry still intact. And I made a pretty poor choice of protecting and switching in Corviknight, even though I knew Expanding Force was coming out. So he went for Expanding Force Assurance onto my Corviknight, and if I got crit, I would have been knocked out, but I comfortably survived it otherwise. So, like, I'm not happy with the way that I took that risk unnecessarily, but the next turn I was just able to Brave Bird the Armourouge because it had terrestrialized into Terra Grass, and I was able to KO it with Brave Bird from about 65% HP as I switched out my Garchomp and Gastrodon to take the Tyranitar Ice Punch. And from there it was just 4v1, and I was going to click Roost Recover to stall at Trick Room until I got my Garchomp able to just Earthquake the Tyranitar in an endgame. That's how that set ended up going. And I was actually a little bit interested to see that he was too scared to bring the Dundoza Tatsugiri, even though I have a fair amount of checks for it. The players in day 2 were certainly not as scared to bring it against me as he ended up being. But yeah, it was a very, very weird set. A lot more RNG than I had wished existed, and like he's a very strong player, regional champion, top 8 internets. Like the list goes on. Like I wouldn't be surprised if he cut every regional he went to this year. Like I don't think anyone would. And I think that he'll put together a string of very strong performances once he figures something out for himself.
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt. He's such a great player. And you've played. I mean, you played a number of really, really good players over the rest of the day. Um, did you have 1 or 2 matchups for the rest of day 1 that you wanted to talk about?
I'll talk about the set against Gahaku first. This was the exact pace that Hamster Mania used to rank 1 the Battle Stadium ladder when it first was released. I didn't know that at the time. I wish I did, but going into this tournament, I didn't think people would be as inclined to use rentals, just because you're like it's already open team sheet, so revealing your spreads is even like further of a disadvantage. But that's also my fault for not like actively paying as much attention to the popular teams that were running around and being posted online. And I would say that I would have been more prepared for it going into like a live event, a regional. But especially like we were like 2 or 3 days into this metagame. Like Series 1 had just been announced during the previous week, so everyone was just kind of going in with their first ideas and just seeing who came out on top with that. As for the matchup, game 1, Annihilate was very controlling. Even though I got the read right on the final gambit, it's still just such an oppressive force because it's fast than most things and it has such a high HP stat to where final gambit is able to knock out whatever it wants to, almost guaranteed. And the real reason this matchup was pretty tough to begin with was because the Hydreigon has Life Orb, Terrifier, Heatwave, which might not sound too bad, but when Amoonguss wants to be brought in this matchup, as well as having sharpness Psycho Cut, it's a very big problem. And I was too scared to bring Amoonguss here, and I shouldn't have been. And that was kind of my downfall as to why I lost this set so quickly. And after day 1 had finished and I got rest and then the morning before day 2 started, I actually played a few practice games and found that just leading Amoonguss would not flip this matchup on its head, but make it way more playable, and it would become a toss up. So the matchup ended up being that Amoonguss and Garchomp would lead, and you would try and trade evenly until Tailwind was over and preserve your Garchomp for out of Tailwind. And then once Tailwind's over, Garchomp just wins. Um, that that unfortunately didn't know how the matchup worked because I didn't test it at all before the tournament. But that's kind of the premise of how that matchup should go for me, and how I wish I had played it, because I think I would have given him a much tougher battle in that case.
I mean, even at that point, you were still 5-1, and of course, you did finish 8-1 in day one. So you made it on to day two with a really good chance of making it to the top 8 cut, or top. I think it was X3 10-3 makes it 11-3. 11-3 makes it top cut.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
So, did you have any other games you wanted to talk about in day one, or do you want to move on to day two?
Tabu's game actually, I think could be highlighted. I think that one was a good set. Not by me. I think he played very well. I don't think I played very well. Um, Game 1, I got into a very dominant position with Tyranitar and Corviknight, and Corviknight got a bulk up off previously, and I expected the Gyarados switch in for the Hariyama because it was in the position. It was Hariyama Armourouge against Tyranitar Corviknight, and Corviknight had used one bulk up. So I figured that Crunch and Brave Bird would knock out, and the Armourouge had 1 pixel of HP left after that double up, so Armor Cannon just ended up knocking out my Corviknight. And if I Terra Flying there with my Corviknight, I had no reason not to. It benefits me all around other than Garchomp. Like, that's the only situation, and those were the 4 he was bringing. He wasn't bringing Amoonguss or Goldengo in all 3 games. Actually, all 4. I'll get to that. But it was a 4-game set. And yeah, I just misplayed in game 1 really, really badly. And then game 2, he ended up. Oh, I'm sorry. The graphics supposed to be loss, win. I apologize. I made a mistake there. Game 2, I ended up getting a similar position with my Garchomp next to my Corviknight with Hariyama Armourouge on the field, and I was trying to keep my Corviknight up from oncoming heat waves, like Life Orb boosted heat waves, which are very strong. And on the turn where I went for Dragon Claw into Armourouge, predicting the Wide Guard to block Earthquake because the Armourouge didn't Terastallize, I ended up not Terastallizing into flying, and I wanted to. I was running low on timer. I was thinking about undoing my Garchomp's move and using Earthquake at the time, but I was pretty sure that he was going to use Wide Guard just because it's my best move, and if I'm not using Earthquake, then I'm not getting a lot of value out of the turn, and the only way that he really loses the turn is by letting me Earthquake. So I think he played that very well, and I was barely able to hold on from oncoming heat waves for multiple turns. The first turn I forgot to Terastallize, and then the next one I did. And I was somehow able to come out with a win in that second game with thanks to the fact that the Hariyama had previously close combated, got a defense drop, so my -1 Garchomp at the time from the Gyarados could Dragon Claw KO the Hariyama from around half, and then Brave Bird after 2 -1 Dragon Claws would knock out the Armourouge, and then I had a 2v4 from there, or it was a 2v3. I think it was a 2v4, and I was just able to match the Gyarados and the Garchomp, setting up with Tailwind from Corviknight, and using my Rotom and my own Garchomp to kind of win from there. And then game 3, I end up getting into a favorable position with Corviknight and something else against Hariyama and something else. and I end up one KOing the Hariyama with Brave Bird. And then a few turns later, I use Brave Bird on a low HP Gyarados that doesn't flinch my Corviknight with Waterfall. And I pick it up from about 25% HP left. And this is when we had a disconnect, which is quite possibly the most unfortunate time for it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Round 9 of day 1 in game 3. And so what ended up happening was I waited on the error code screen for like 5 minutes as we were trying to clarify what ended up happening. In the meantime, I was talking with some friends and just joking around, just trying to like not keep my mind on the fact that like this could possibly dictate my entire tournament run. And I was trying to record all of these games, so I was under the impression that I had footage, and I claimed to have footage, but the problem is that my recording froze in game 3 Steam Preview. Just froze.
Uh-huh.
So I couldn't prove that I was online.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I was when I finally like exited out. I didn't exit out of the error code screen until they had said that like if nobody can prove it, then like there's gonna have to be a replay of game 3.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't prove it, but I was told from friends that the error code indicated that the disconnect was on my opponent's end. I obviously can't prove that, and we both didn't want to be playing for any longer. We'd already been playing 8 rounds at this point. We're in the 9th round, and for him it was like 1 a.m. For me, it was 7 p.m. I had been up for 9 to 10 hours at this point. I hadn't eaten anything all day, so we were both just kind of like out of it. But Billa told us that we had to play a 4th game for the result, unless if one of us wanted to forfeit, and of course neither of us are going to do that, because the rules state that unless if both players like can mutually agree on a winner, then it has to be replayed. So we ended up replaying it, and it was a very close game 4, which went down like to the wire, and I ended up like somehow pulling it off. Like I do think my matchup was advantageous. I just wasn't playing well.
It sounds like you were very tired by that point.
And yeah, my brain was on low power mode. I was out of it. I was completely gone,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't very characteristic because I feel like I have much better mental endurance, but I don't think I made the best decisions for my health by kind of sitting in a chair and playing Pokemon for like 9 to 10 hours without putting anything in my body
Yep.
to help
I
fuel
mean,
me. So
people don't realize,
yeah,
but like when you're playing a game like Pokemon, it's comparable to chess in terms of like the mental power that you're using. And there's been studies that like how many calories chess players are burning just by sitting in the chair and thinking for 8 hours straight. I think it's a Pokemon tournament is very similar. So it absolutely is exhausting, especially if you haven't eaten all day. And it's something that, I mean, honestly, you just got to get in the routine for because San Diego Regionals, which I think both of us are probably going to, is going to be 10 rounds unless something changes. And getting out to be ready for, you're going to have to be ready for that.
I heard possible discussions of them maybe considering splitting it up into 2 flights, similar to how 2016 Worlds went. I think that would be very cool, and I think that that's the way to go. And I certainly hope that's the decision they make, regardless if I attend or not. I think it would be a better experience for everyone because having a 10th round, like making someone go 8-2 to cut instead of 7-2, just feels like kind of unnecessary. And I feel like it, like a lot of times, like if you're in that like 10th round and you're 7-2 and you still have to like win another, like you feel like you've already cut it up, but you feel like you've already done the work that you needed to do, right? Like let's call it for the night, and then I can come back here tomorrow and uh, play my top 32 set or day 2 Swiss if they decide to do that as well. I hope they do day 2 Swiss. I think that was a very
That's
good system for this tournament. I'm a fan of it.
right.
I think that It is way better and way more consistent and way more rewarding in the long term. Like,
Mhm.
it's 5 rounds. They're gonna have 7 streamed cut matches anyway, right? I feel like they should be able to squeeze that in, especially since TCG is there usually until the mid afternoon. I feel like VGC can do that too. I'd like to see that. I think that's a good
That's
system for these larger events.
That's exactly how I feel. I think the Day 2 Swiss with a 500 player tournament is absolutely mandatory. It's a shame if they make us play 10 rounds. Dallas 2020, I didn't attend, but I've heard horror stories about how long and grueling that was. And I mean,
Yeah,
it's
that was an experience for
just
sure.
and just like looking at this tournament, right? If you had a top 32 cut, you potentially lose your first top cut match. You went 8-1. You were fourth after Swiss, and you were not the 32nd best player at this tournament. But anything can happen in one set of Pokemon, and so having Day 2 Swiss and then having a smaller top cut really rewards the players who did well in Swiss, especially in Day 1 Swiss. Um, and so that is definitely my preferred format as well. And I really hope that we get an update to the rules document, which hasn't been updated in a while for VGC, giving us Day 2 Swiss, especially given that TCG already has that. They already have the implementation in the tournament software. It just requires us to be allowed to do it in the video game side of things.
Yeah, I agree on all fronts. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of Day 2 Swiss, you, of course, had to play 5 more rounds of Pokemon the next day before Top Cut. And you, of course, did extremely well there too. So tell me about your Day 2 Swiss run.
Okay. So the matchup against River, aka Black, my first opponent in day two, um, ended up having this Terra Steel Goggles Dondozo that I was referring to earlier, and that means I can't bring Amoonguss. So, however, this does mean that I can bring Garchomp Rotom on lead and have it be very effective. So, game one, he goes with Garchomp Dondozo, and I go with Garchomp and Rotom. And so the play that covers quite literally every option from River here is if I Terra Ground Earthquake and I Voltage off that Dondozo. Because it doesn't have Protect, and regardless whether it Terras or not, I'm hitting it super effectively with something. And if he stays in with the Garchomp, then I get a clean knockout on Dondozo, and if you switch to Tatsugiri, then I'm hitting it twice, one of which is going to be super effective, and I'm going to have to force it to rest the next turn, which ended up happening. I switched Tatsugiri, he Terra Steeled, Earthquake did about half, and before the Earthquake, actually, his Dondozo was faster than my Garchomp at +2, which is very interesting speed. And he tried to go for the order up KO immediately, which I found to be very interesting, but Terragon covers that anyway. Um, I didn't necessarily expect it to be faster, but I didn't want to discount the order up play on turn one, which was another reason why that was pretty strong. And from there, I go out into Corviknight. I protect Tailwind as he rests, and from there, I Earthquake and switch back into Rotom. And a lot of people might question why I switched back into Rotom immediately there instead of setting up and letting my Garchomp go down and then getting into Rotom. And I have a free turn of setup with Corviknight. The reason is you can actually sleep talk into rest. So there's a 1/3 chance that he just doesn't get the move he wants to hit my Garchomp, and he gets no value that turn. And then Earthquake knocks out the next turn. I have Rotom doing something productive, or more productive, I should say, into the Tatsugiri that can't do anything that turn. I can Thunderbolt or Volt Switch or discharge it. Any of those three options work very well. Preferably Volt Switch to go back into Corviknight, and try and end game from there, because it's just better into the AV Hydreigon he has. Um, or even like keeping my Rotom safe and preserving it for the Goldango in late game. I'd rather just have Corviknight take a ton of damage, have my Garchomp be very offensive into those Pokemon and playing from there. And then game two and game three ended up being more Talonflame centric games from him, I believe. I know game three came down to if Goldango was able to take like multiple icy wins, and then the Garchomp and Hydreigon. Ended up using Earthquake and Dark Pulse as I Terra Fairy'd because I thought that he would actually just go for the Draco Meteor to win the game. But I flinched off the Dark Pulse. So that meant that the -3 speed Hydreigon, which if I set it to -4, my Gastrodon would have been faster. I would have KO'd the Garchomp, and then I could have recover stalled maybe against the Terra Steel Flash Cannon from Hydreigon until timer. We had like 3 or 4 minutes left at that point, so I'm not sure if I would have been given that out, considering that this is an online tournament, not a live tournament. But it was certainly like an out that I had in other conditions. And this was not like a very easy matchup because of how like strong the Dondozo is into me with those two techs. And the Goldango got a lot of value too, just because I didn't have a lot of strong damage into it at that point, and I wanted to cover possible Garchomp switch with Icy Wind, and yeah, it was a very close set. It was very fun, and I certainly wasn't like too upset at myself for losing to a player like him. I mean, he's a regional champion. He's cut 3 of the regionals, I believe, and he's been around for a while. And it's pretty cool to see him, come back and do pretty well in a new meta.
Yeah, and he's a fantastic player. And then, so I guess kind of showing the alternative ways that Dondozo can be built that might be a little tougher for your team. Although you still seems like you had a perfectly fine game plan matchup into it, and maybe a little unlucky as well. That's Pokemon. And then, of course, you play Dondozo the next round as well. So how did that set go?
So, okay. So this set, all 3 games, the first 2 games, it revolved around Dragapult Colossal leads into Garchomp Tyranitar. And game 1, I get the call wrong on which Pokemon I get Will-O-Wisped, and game 2, I do. So game 1, I get my Tyranitar Will-O-Wisp as I protect my Garchomp, and my Crunch does like 60 or 70% to Dragapult, however much Burn Crunch does. Point is, it's not KOing, and that's very bad. Right? I need to get the KO. And then game 2, I stick with that play, and I get the call right, because I figure that my opponent is anticipating an adjustment from me. And I'm able to just win the game from there, because I believe that my opponent even went for Explosion on turn 1 with the Colossal, funnily enough. And from there, he had Tatsugiri Dondozo in the back, and I was just able to win 4v1 basically, because like he's stuck 2v1 due to how Dondozo and Tatsugiri work. So I'm just able to clean up the game from there. And then game 3, I end up leading the same Pokemon into what I believe was it was Dragapult Tatsugiri, game 3, actually. And it was Specs Tatsugiri. And he goes for Will-O-Wisp turn 1 into my Garchomp and misses on Sandvale Chomp, which I don't think matters because Life Orb Dragon Claw is actually a favorable roll, even when burned on Tatsugiri. I believe it's 62.5% chance to KO. And even then, Sandchip is going to knock it out. So, unless if it was going for Draco Meteor into my Garchomp, which isn't very logical considering that you went for Will-O-Wisp into it, he was likely going for Muddy Water or Icy Wind, I guess. I did switch in my Gastrodon for the Tyranitar slot, and I ended up just having like a pretty good position with a fairly healthy Garchomp, not burned, and a Gastrodon out there, because I had one-shot the Tatsugiri with the Dragon Claw due to me not being burned, and even then it's like maybe I get the roll, maybe I don't, and even then Tatsugiri drops to the Sandchip at the end of the turn, regardless. And from here is where I make a very fatal blunder, and he brings an Armarouge. And I figured that because my Gastrodon is so obvious just sitting here, that there's no way you go for the Energy Ball. right? It's just not going to happen, right? So I figured the Amoonguss switch was obvious, or Terra Fairy at this point was obvious. So of course, like the expanding force, or even like calling the switch and heat waving is probably the better play. And I guess like I don't really know why I was inclined to make the decision on this read because I didn't need to. Could have just sacrificed the Mingus and went from there. Um, I didn't need to make the risk, and for some reason I did, and I just lost my Gastrodon, which means that I pretty much lose the end game to Dondozo with Unaware, especially because Expanding Force nearly one shots my Amoonguss. I think I took it with like 3 HP left or something. Uh, Goes down to sand, and then Dondozo is able to wall my Garchomp and Tyranitar 1v2. Even if he gives the policy boost, it's still unaware, so I'm not doing any more damage, even though he hits me with liquidation in an endgame. And from there, I ended up losing like 2 close sets, both of which I felt like I had very reasonable chances to win, uh, and I just didn't. And both of these, I think, were still in my control, uh, and I just didn't end up playing well enough to secure either of them, which could be frustrating. But something River actually told me that I still remember to this day. It was like early 2019 or something like that along those lines, and I remember him saying when I was talking about being so concerned about like taking a loss early on in a tournament, he's like, just expect the loss to come eventually, and you'll be able to just play without the expectation of trying to win every single round. And I felt like more connected to that idea, like more and more in the past few months, and I think that's led to me like being able to um, just play through losses a lot easier. And weirdly enough, after I had lost these 2 sets in day 2, I played possibly the most like the 2 most accurate sets I played of the entire tournament back to back when I was like lose and go home, right? Like tournament life is on the line. Like I really couldn't have asked for a better time to like feel errorless in a way in these 2 sets, which I
Mhm.
guess is a great time to transition into round 12, right?
Yeah, yeah, go
Um,
for it.
so I'm playing against Terran. Like I feel like he's a household name at this point. This past season, I feel like has put him on the map as one of the stronger UK players. He ended up having very impressive run at Liverpool, I believe 8-0, and then top eight of that, and then came to NAIC later on in the year and top eight at NAIC. So if he finds a composition and he practices it, he's going to be very, very strong and a force to be reckoned with. So, but fortunately for me, I have Corviknight, which is possibly the most ideal Pokemon that you could have into this team. Um, However, Meowscarada is still very scary. I don't know. I believe it was choice banned, if I'm not mistaken. I believe so. Yes, it was choice banned Meowscarada. So Corviknight is really all I have. So I believe I ended up leading Corviknight Rotom, and um, I went for Brave Bird into Meowscarada and Volt Switch off the Murkrow. I believe that he went for knockoff into my Corviknight, did like 55-60% or something around that range. And I don't know if he set up Tailwind or taunted my Corviknight. I'm not sure, but I believe he was also Focus Sash on Corviknight on Murkrow. Sorry, I believe it was Focus Sash. I believe he was the one that had Focus Sash on his Murkrow. Yeah, he was. I end up Volt Switching out into Garchomp. I protect Garchomp on a Banded Knockoff and Foul Play Double Up, and I KO the Mascot with a second Brave Bird. Because it's a guaranteed KO if they're grass type still, and this one was just dark because of Protean. Um, and from there, I was just able to win the game quite comfortably. And then game 2, he ended up adjusting to Goldango and Amoonguss, which I didn't necessarily expect coming. I expected the Amoonguss. I didn't expect the Goldango. I thought the Goldango wasn't that strong, unless if it was in the back and waiting to come in for Tailwind, to abuse the Tailwind. I didn't think it was a very strong lead. But this is where open team sheets makes it so that I can play very, very consistently. And because I knew that it was Terra Rock, I could safely discharge and switch out my Corviknight into Garchomp, and he ends up going for Rage Powder Nasty Plot, which is like it can seem threatening because the Goldango is faster than my Rotom, but it's not a problem because I can just Earthquake the following turn as the Terra Rocked, and the Goldango can't, therefore can't Terra Flying. I believe this one was Terra Flying as well. Yes, it was Terra Flying. So Earthquake is just safe the next turn, and we'll clean up the game from there. And I pretty much won this game on turn one. Simple as that. And I felt very solid about the way that I played it. I feel like he could have played it a bit better by protecting Goldango and sporing into my Rotom slot, as he knows I'm not safety goggles. And then he can go for the nasty plot or switch out and play from there. But yeah, I don't think I really misstepped too much in this set. I feel like I understood what I was doing and covered my options pretty well into a more volatile team.
Yeah. And then, so of course, that's a really big win. He is, of course, a phenomenal player. And then, of course, you had a couple more matches. You had to win both of them before making it to top cut. Were either of those matches especially notable?
Um, the one under Rex Chaos was, I wouldn't say it was like not notable, but it was favorable for me just because I could play around Garchomp Rotom on lead and then have Corviknight and Gastrodon back, and those four are pretty strong. And I was just able to cover all of my options every turn with uh, being able to Terra Ground Volt Switch on the Annihilate turn one because he went with Garchomp Annihilate, and I got it down to like 1 HP as it tried to bulk up. Like, just I was able to get a ton of damage down on it, and even if it Rage Fists there, it's not setting up, so it's no longer threatening. And if it's not setting up, then I can just get into Corviknight later, set up Tailwind, and Gastrodon will entirely wall the Rotom, and we'll beat the Garchomp, can Clear Smog the Sylveon for damage. I believe this one was, this one was the Leftovers Calm Mind set, so I can Clear Smog the Calm Mind as well, and even Clear Smog the Annihilate. And I just had a lot of tools in this matchup, and as long as I don't, as long as I play like pretty close to safe like every turn, I should be good to go. And I was able to control Tailwind and being able to discharge next to my two ground types very well, and very safely ended up setting up my Gastrodon for successful end games with its partners. And I don't exactly remember the game 2 went, but the Rotom was near worthless like the entire time just because of how strong Gastrodon was here. And Corviknight was very good into everything that wasn't the Rotom. So I feel like that summarizes, like if you look at it, I feel like it's pretty understandable just looking at it as well. And Corviknight can, like, sure, it's not the best to take a Thunderbolt, but it's also not incredibly strong at the same time because Corviknight's like relatively bulky, and a lot of the more supportive Rotom don't have a lot of special attack investment, so the Thunderbolt isn't actually hurting as bad as people would think. And hey, he brought the 4 Pokemon that I think gave him the best chance of winning this matchup. I think that I just had a very favorable matchup and didn't really make mistakes. And I feel like there's not too much else to say besides that, right? It's just what it is sometimes. Since I was in a win and in, I was very much under the impression that I had to make plays that were more day 2 caliber, right? Or play more in anticipation of what my opponent is going to do and making sure that I can counteract that. And game 1 goes like pretty much as poorly as it could have as a result, because I lead with Garchomp Rotom again, which was a very, very common lead in day 2. I did it into almost every single team. Rotom, I think, actually ended up leading into every single matchup besides Kitwaller in round 11. So that's a very interesting stat to think about, where like Garchomp and Rotom are just so safe on lead in a lot of matchups. But I end up trying to Rock Slide and Volt Switch. Or no, sorry, I didn't even Volt Switch turn 1 because I was predicting Dark Pulse into Rotom and Tailwind, because the protect on Garchomp is relatively obvious and you don't want to lower your special attack. So getting good damage on the Rotom and then going from there, especially because it has Terra Steel on the Hydreigon, I figured that was the play. And I end up getting hit with a Draco Meteor on my Garchomp. And I just got the call wrong. And then from there, the matchup just kind of like slipped from me in game 1 because the Garchomp and Sylveon just got like next to each other in Tailwind and started doing a lot of damage to my team. And because I had brought Gastrodon, Corviknight, Rotom on top of my Garchomp, I didn't have enough to deal with that. And I ended up just losing the game 1 like pretty badly. I believe it was like a 4-0 or like a 3-0. Like pretty bad loss. And then game 2, we ended up playing the exact same Pokemon, and I end up doing the exact same play, except I Dragon Claw the Hydreigon this time, and I get it right. So I Dragon Claw Oko the Hydreigon after Draco Meteors my Rotom, and Talonflame sets Tailwind, and Volt Switch Oko's the Talonflame. So then I have a full health Garchomp, and now a Corviknight against Sylveon and Garchomp. But my opponent's in Tailwind. And here I just go for Terragon and Earthquake because on my opponent's team sheet, they have Substitute and Swords Dance. And I thought to myself, there's no way that my opponent just attacks here because they're threatening like a lot of damage with this momentum. And the only way that they're going to win, realistically, is if I just let them set up on me. All right, so I can Terragon Earthquake. It does like 70% of Garchomp, breaks Sylveon subs. I set Tailwind. And from here, I'm just able to stop the Tailwind, and then my Garchomp is able to win when Corviknight just walls those 2 Pokemon anyway. And then game 3, we end up going with the exact same leads for the 3rd time. Garchomp, Rotom, Hydreigon, Talonflame. And this time I do expect some sort of deviation from how the previous 2 games went. I feel like he really doesn't want to play the guessing game on what protects, what doesn't, and leaving the game up to that. So I expect some sort of adjustment. So in team review, I looked over at his team sheet again, and I felt like his adjustment, if he led the same thing, was going to be Will-O-Wisp and Snarl turn 1, which is exactly what ended up happening. So I switched on my Garchomp into Corviknight to take the Will-O-Wisp, which sounds counterintuitive, but was my best play at the time, as I take Snarl, and I Volt Switch the Talonflame down to 10% HP, which then allows me to bring back in Garchomp, and now I have Corviknight Garchomp with a -1 Hydreigon, because I Mirror Armored the Snarl, right? And now I have a pretty good position where if once this Talonflame's gone, my opponent now has like no way of stopping my Tailwind or like my Corviknight from running away with the game. Because then its best damage is Dark Pulse from Hydreigon at that point. So the next turn, he goes for Taunt onto my Corviknight, and he Draco Meteors into my Garchomp's Protect, which, like, really good turn for me because I Brave Bird the Talonflame, knock it out, and now he's down to 3 Pokemon. I have 4 Pokemon. My Garchomp's faster than the Hydreigon the next turn, so he's forced to bring in Sylveon, and Dragon Claw into Hydreigon will either KO the Hydreigon or KO the Garchomp that's in the back because I'm Life Orb. So he's forced to Terrastalize, right? And because I know this, Terra Ground to do 90% to Sylveon, as I switch my Corviknight out into Rotom to reset the taunt, and then -1 Draco Meteor plus Hyper Voice is able to knock out my Garchomp from about, I believe it was it full? I think it was like 85% at the time. I don't know what it got damaged by. Maybe it was full at the time, but I got knocked out by the double up, even though neither was super effective. And then from there, I get back into my Corviknight. I'm able to set up Tailwind, and I have a very, very safe lock on the game because I knew that if I was able to force the Terrestrialization, Discharge plus Icy Wind can't be stopped by Steel type Hydreigon, Low Sylveon, and a Garchomp in the back. And so from here, I'm just able to win the game by hitting Icy Winds and not being forced to rely on my Corviknight, other than setting up Tailwind and just allowing me to more safely win the game from there. And that's how I ended up securing my top 8 spot.
Yeah. So again, another really impressive win over a very good player. And then last but not least, you did have to play out a top cut against another really good player, Italian player Lele. And we talked a little bit in the team report, I guess, part of it, where I thought you were a little weak to fighting types. And we do see the other fighting type in the format that we hadn't really considered in Breloom, a little unorthodox. But tell me about how this matchup went.
So Breloom does pose some problems, but I think that was mainly because I just played poorly. And yeah, Lele Briganti, very good player, but I definitely had like the ability to win this set was in my control. It just like I just didn't play well. He ended up switching out his Breloom turn 1 on a clear smog because he knew that I needed damage on it early. And from there, he was just able to preserve Breloom and Hydreigon to beat the rest of my team later on after he Will-O-Wisp my Garchomp on the second turn. And I ended up like double flinching his Garchomp and his Breloom later on in the game and Icy Winding it on the same turn, but it didn't really matter because like he's in such a crushing position and like I don't really have like much counterplay besides Rock Slide flinching a ton of times. He got himself into a really good position, and the game just like was lost from there. I ended up getting my Amoonguss Flare Blitz turn 1 as well, which made it so that my Amoonguss couldn't stay on the field at the time, and once it gets Flare Blitz once, even if I get Regenerator, it's going to go down to another Flare Blitz. So that was a problem. And then game 2, I tried to use Dragon Claw and Sand Chip to knock out the Breloom because it's Focus Sash. And Dragon Claw plus a turn of Sand Chip doesn't actually knock out the Breloom. Just barely. Which I was very surprised about. And from there, he was able to make a really nice Spore play, predicting my Tyranitar to switch out as he had Spored it the first turn. And he Spored my Corviknight on the switch in, which is a very good play. I did have a Amoonguss in the back, and I should have just gone into that because I felt like that was actually a potential play I could have made. I did respect it in my thought process, but overall, I just didn't end up making that play. And from there, like the game was pretty much lost. Like Hydreigon and Garchomp are able to run away with it, and Breloom is able to do a lot of damage. Arcanine is able to mitigate a lot of my damage as well, and yeah. I think that if I had played a lot better with my Amoonguss, I could have spored the Arcanine turn 1 of game 1 instead of Clear Smog the Breloom. I was just a little concerned that he would Terra Grass the Arcanine to just block the Spore. So it felt 50-50 in a way. I still probably should have gone for it just to force the Terra Grass because it's much less threatening than a Terra Hydreigon or Terra Garchomp. I feel like that was the much better way to play it. Was just to force his hand and then make him waste his resources and then get into a better position and try and win from there. But I made similar mistakes in this one that I did to the set that I played against Gahaku. It was just a few different mons and different playstyle.
Yeah. But nonetheless, again, 7th place out of 455 players. A really, really impressive finish with a a really cool team, very defensive, very like robust, has matchups into seemingly everything. Uh, and yeah, I definitely would recommend you try to rebuild it, try it out because it is really, really solid into all of the stuff that is common right now. But on that note, did you have any final words or shout outs that you wanted to give?
Yes, I have probably like a minute's worth of shout outs because I think a lot of people were involved in this performance that I had. First, Ducky helped me by like staying up with me in EV training, our teams for the tournament. Um, Helped me get the Terragon Garchomp and the Terra Fairy Gastrodon, which was a big deal to my run. I feel like I emphasized how important those were, and I did use Terragon Earthquake a lot of times, and it was very strong. Um, and it was very important to my run. Uh, and it motivated me that someone else was willing to stay up and EV train their team before the tournament, and made me feel kind of obligated to like if I'm already this far in, I might as well play. Because I didn't really feel like playing after having to spend 3.5 to 4 hours getting all this stuff in game, but it's just how it is. Next, Hobbit. Henry ended up going 7-2 day one, and then he started out 3-0 in day two. And it was nice to talk with him in between rounds. He was a nice positive reinforcer, encouraged me to do really well, and it was nice having someone to talk to in between rounds that was still in the tournament. It's really motivating, especially when both of us were playing our win-ins, and yeah, it was just really cool to see someone that I knew that I could also talk to that was playing in the tournament and was like in a similar headspace that I was. Next, Jamie Keane. He was the original inspiration for this Gastrodon, as I mentioned, with Terra Fairy Storm Drain Tatsugiri, as insane as it sounds. And then Brady eventually made it a Gastrodon, although he used like a more, I guess, standard looking set. Maybe this is becoming the standard now. What I used, I don't know if that's the case. That's for other people to. I guess that's for the community to find out if this becomes the standard Gastrodon set. I felt like every move was great, and I wouldn't change anything about it. It was very important for helping my Rotom and my Corviknight because Corviknight and Gastrodon are a perfect pair in terms of their defensive capabilities. It was very important to my run. Brady and Sven both helped me test the Hamster Mania matchup before day two, which made me confident that I would be fine into a rematch against Gahaku because we both lost our first 2 rounds and we both won our last 3 rounds of day two after going in one. So I had 5 chances to get paired against him, and I didn't get paired against him once, but I was definitely more prepared for a rematch next time. And I'm pretty happy I didn't have to play him though, just because I wanted, like, I was happy that both of us cut, because he's very supportive of the Western scene for a Japanese player, very involved in the Western scene, I would say, more so than most other Japanese players, and it's really cool to see him cut too. And then Jarshel, Scotty, Stainer, and Ola, they all were very supportive of me, encouraging to me throughout my run too. Every time I was like, okay, this is my record now after every round. Like they just wouldn't get tired of it, or pretended to at least not be tired of it, which sometimes is what you have to do if you're more supportive of someone. And I guess the record part ended up just becoming a little bit numb to me, as I felt like I was more so later in the tournament playing at the level that deserved the record, just because of a few like RNG events, as I mentioned, the Animus, even though statistically I wasn't the more lucky player in the set, but I definitely felt like it just because of how the events transpired. And then lastly, everyone else who supported me and like sent me kind words at the weekend. I have an overwhelming amount of messages I have to attend to from people that I need to respond to that I haven't yet. And I hope that any questions about the team were like answered in this or in some form. And if I didn't answer anything, I guess people can comment, and I'll be looking through the comments in days after this is uploaded and trying to respond to as many people as possible about any questions about this team. I think it's pretty strong. I by no means think that this is like a perfect team or anything like that. I think it does have a lot of really good matchups, good matchup spread, covers a majority of what's going, like what's strong right now. But I'm sure that there will be some teams that have like very, very strong matchups into this team. And I think that most of the success of my run is attributed to the fact that it was just very strong defensively and it meshes with my play style. I'm a player who likes to switch a lot, who likes to play longer games because I find that I make less mistakes than other people. If I'm playing much longer games, I can force other people to make errors first. And sometimes that's all you need to win games is just people making more mistakes than you and you making less mistakes than others. And having a team where I had consistent modes that I knew what to do into opponents, where I had just overall bulk and I don't want to say forgiving bulk for errors made. Like if I make one error, it's still playable. But if I make like two mistakes in a game, then it's probably lost. I'd say it's one of the more punishing teams to play. So you really have to know what you're doing with it if you want to have good success with it. But that being said, it's a very rewarding team to play. It's probably one of the more rewarding teams to play. And um, oddly enough, was the most unique team to top cut. Somehow I was the only person with Rotom-Heat, Corviknight, and Gastrodon in day 2, any of those Pokemon. And I was the only person in top cut with any of these 5 on my team except for Garchomp. That was the only Pokemon I shared in common with the rest of top cut, which I couldn't believe. Like not even Amoonguss was in top 8
That's
besides
crazy.
me,
Yeah.
which is like kind of unbelievable. But
Mhm.
that's how the stats ended up playing out. Um, so it was very weird that like like between my team and everyone else's, how my team ended up being perceived as like one of the more creative, even though it's just a lot of more standard Pokemon and a lot of other metagames. But I guess a lot of people were looking into like playing with the newer Pokemon, which is why people were intrigued to see that I had basically rolled up with a Series 2 team that also just had an Amoonguss and somehow got this far. Um, but I think that the idea behind the team, the concept was very strong. And going back, I don't think I would change anything on this team. I think it was uh, good for the tournament. And like, I lost the money match, but we made the graphic. And I guess that's all that counts. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't have changed anything. And I'm very happy with what I brought this tournament.
Yeah. Again, really, really impressive run. Top 8 out of 450 odd players. You played some of the best players in the world, and by and large, came out on top, which is really impressive with a team that um, really rewards solid play. I think you don't, like you said, you're not choosing people. You are just playing defensively and really giving yourself the room to outplay your opponents. So again, really, really impressive run. Um, and yeah, thank you so much for coming on the channel and explaining your team. I really appreciate it. Make sure to comment down below if you have any further questions about the team, and make sure to like and subscribe, of course. And yeah, thank you all for watching. And until next time, I will see you all later.